The tapes shouldn't have survived. That's what the forensic analyst kept saying as she handled the waterlogged camcorder, its casing warped from decades submerged beneath Black Ridge Reservoir. 25 years underwater should have erased everything. The magnetized particles deteriorating, the plastic housing disintegrating, the truth disappearing forever into the murky depths. But some truths refuse to stay buried. For 25 years, everyone thought the Coldwells simply disappeared. Lucy Tran narrates, her voice steady, despite the gravity of what she's uncovering. But when that footage surfaced, grainy, waterlogged, and incomplete, it exposed something this town was never meant to see. The most terrifying part? It wasn't what happened to them. It was who made sure we never found out. The morning fog hung thick over Black Ridge Reservoir, turning the dense Oregon forest into a watercolor painting of muted grays and greens. Park Ranger David Holloway's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his routine patrol along the eastern logging road. The weekend campers would be gone by now, heading back to jobs and schools, leaving only boot prints and forgotten marshmallow sticks behind. He almost missed it. The dark blue Dodge Caravan pulled neatly to the side of the road, windows fogged with condensation. Nothing unusual about a camper van in October. The fall colors drew plenty of weekend warriors to Black Ridge. But something felt wrong. Holloway tapped his knuckles against the driver's window. No response. He tried the door. Locked. Using his flashlight to cut through the condensation, he peered inside. A picnic basket sat on the center console, still packed with unopened packages of hot dogs and buns. 2 children's jackets were folded neatly on the back seat. A woman's purse rested on the passenger floorboard, and a tent, half assembled, lay across the cargo area. He radioed dispatch. "I've got an abandoned vehicle at mile marker 17 on Black Ridge East Road. License plate Echo Romeo Charlie 349. Can you run that?" The crackling response came seconds later. Vehicle registered to Mark and Elaine Coldwell, 1442 Maple Street, Elmridge. Any reports of hikers in distress or missing persons? Negative. Nothing reported. Holloway circled the van again, this time noticing the small sneaker prints leading away from the vehicle and toward the water's edge. Adults' prints followed, 4 sets in total, 2 large, 2 small. Probably just a family enjoying the morning at the lake, he reasoned. But why leave everything in the van? "I'll check the shoreline," he told dispatch. "Probably just lost track of time." What Ranger Holloway didn't know as he followed those prints down to the water's edge was that he was walking into Elmridge's darkest mystery, one that would remain unsolved for a quarter century. The Coldwells, Mark, 38, Elaine, 35, Sam, 8, and Lily, 5, had been seen less than 48 hours earlier at Miller's Gas and Grocery on Aro, the edge of town. Security footage later showed them smiling, buying marshmallows, and a single disposable camera. Mark held the door for an elderly couple. Elaine helped Lily tie her shoelace on the sidewalk outside. Sam carried the grocery bag proudly to the van. 4 normal people on what should have been a normal weekend camping trip. But as Holloway's radio squawked with updates, the first shadow of something inexplicable began to form. The footprints led directly to the water and simply stopped. No returning tracks. No signs of disturbance along the muddy shore. No indication of where a family of 4 could possibly have gone. A fish leapt from the still water, breaking the perfect silence with a splash that made Holloway flinch. Somewhere nearby, a child's small toy, a plastic dinosaur, lay nearly covered by wet pine needles. By noon, 3 more rangers had arrived. By 2, the sheriff's department had established a command post. By sunset, the first ripples of unease were spreading through Elmridge, a town of 8,500 where the Coldwells were known to everyone. Mark coached Little League. Elaine volunteered at the library, They attended First Presbyterian on Sundays and helped organize the Fall Harvest Festival every year. They weren't the type to vanish, yet vanish they had. At first, everyone assumed the Coldwells were just lost. Sheriff Henry Lorne would later tell reporters, his face carefully composed. But by the third day, we realized something was keeping them hidden. Something or someone. Family of 4 missing in Black Ridge Wilderness, read the Elm Ridge Gazette's front page on Wednesday morning. Below the headline, a family portrait showed the Coldwells at last year's church picnic. Mark's arm around Elaine's shoulders, Sam missing his 2 front teeth, tiny Lily clutching a stuffed rabbit. The search operation began with practiced efficiency. Sheriff Lorne had handled dozens of lost hiker cases in his 17 years with the department. The protocol was clear: establish a command center, organize volunteer search parties, request air support from the county, and systematically cover the terrain in expanding grids. It's a routine wilderness search, he assured the gathering crowd of volunteers at the reservoir parking lot. Folks get turned around in these woods all the time. We'll find them. Yet within hours, the routine search began revealing patterns that didn't add up. Deputy Chris Marlin, examining the area around the van, noticed something odd about the tire tracks. They show the van arrived parked in one position, then was moved and reparked hours later, after dark, he noted in his report. The second set of tracks cuts deeper into the mud, suggesting additional weight in the vehicle. Inside the van, more inconsistencies emerged. The tent was partially unpacked, but the poles were missing. The cooler contained untouched food, ice still frozen solid. Elaine's purse held $143 in cash, all her credit cards, and her driver's license. Her cell phone sat in the cup holder, battery dead. Most telling was what they didn't find. No trash, no sign of campfire ash, no food remnants. Unusual for a family with young children who had supposedly spent at least one night at the site. By Wednesday afternoon, the search had expanded to include 3 counties' worth of volunteers, K-9 units, and a National Guard helicopter equipped with thermal imaging. The dogs tracked scents to the water's edge before losing the trail completely. The helicopter detected no heat signatures in the dense forest. As evening approached, Jason Merrick, a local hiker who had been camping 2 miles south that weekend, approached the command post with information that would shift the investigation's trajectory. I saw lights Saturday night, he told Deputy Marlin. Not at the main camping area, but across the reservoir, on the north shore where nobody usually goes. Looked like lanterns moving between the trees. I figured it was just other campers, but that area's all marsh and deadfall. Not anywhere anyone would normally set up. Deputy Marlin added the detail to his growing file of anomalies. The North Shore was private property, technically outside the ranger's jurisdiction, land owned by a group called the Hollow Creek Collective, who maintained it as an ecological restoration project. "Any chance you got pictures of those lights?" Marlin asked Merrick. The hiker shook his head. "Too far away. And honestly, didn't think much of it until I heard about the missing family. But something else. There was chanting or singing, hard to tell across water, but it wasn't just voices talking. It had a rhythm to it." As the second day of searching ended without results, Sheriff Lorne maintained his composed exterior while privately sharing concerns with his senior deputies. "This isn't adding up to a typical lost hiker scenario," he admitted. "The van was deliberately repositioned. The family's belongings are all there, undisturbed. And now we hear about lights and chanting from across the water? Let's keep this quiet until we know more. But I'm upgrading this to a potential criminal investigation. What no one in the sheriff's department knew yet was how the Coldwells' disappearance mirrored other cases, like the Jameson family in Oklahoma, who vanished in 2009 while viewing a rural property. Their truck found containing their phones, IDs, and $32,000 in cash. Or the McStay family from California, who disappeared in 2010, with half-eaten bowls of popcorn left on the counter as if they'd simply walked away mid-snack. Cases where normalcy became the mask for something far more sinister. By Thursday morning, the previously bustling campgrounds around Black Ridge Reservoir sat empty. Families who had planned weekend trips suddenly canceled reservations. Locals who had fished the reservoir for decades found reasons to stay home. Something was wrong at Black Ridge, but no one would say it aloud yet. The forest itself seemed complicit, absorbing footprints, swallowing evidence, muting sound. The more searchers combed through it, the less they seemed to find, as if the woods were erasing themselves around the mystery. When you've worked search and rescue as long as I have, Ranger Holloway told Lucy Tran years later, you develop a sense for what the forest is telling you. Sometimes it's saying, they went this way. Sometimes it's saying, they're right here, keep looking. But with the Coldwells, it was like the forest was saying, they were never here at all. And that's impossible, because we had their footprints going to the water, 4 sets in, none coming out. But when search teams returned on the 4th morning, something appeared that changed the tone of the entire search. It was no longer a rescue. It was an investigation. The National Guard helicopter pilot spotted it first, a metallic glint in the shallows near the northern shore of the reservoir, where the depth dropped off suddenly from 4 feet to nearly 30. The area was mapped as part of Hollow Creek's private property, but Sheriff Lorne quickly secured an emergency search warrant. Divers retrieved what appeared to be a broken camcorder tripod, its metal legs bent at unnatural angles, and a small fragment of wetsuit material. The tripod was marked with surface rust, but matched the brand that Mark Coldwell, an amateur wildlife photographer, was known to own. The wetsuit fragment bore the initials GS, not matching any Coldwell family member. That's when I knew this wasn't about a family getting lost, Sheriff Lorne recalled. People don't bring wetsuits for October camping in Oregon unless they're planning something specific. And the Coldwells weren't divers. While forensics examined the recovered items, Deputy Marlin took the initiative to review 911 call archives for the weekend in question. One entry caught his attention, a garbled call logged at 11:17 p.m. Saturday night, initially dismissed as radio interference. When enhanced by the county's audio specialist, fragments became audible. Chanting, by the water, firelight, children crying, they're making them. The rest dissolved into static. The call had been written off as a prank or noise interference from CB radios used by local off-roaders. The dispatcher had sent a patrol car to drive past the reservoir entrance, but the officer reported seeing nothing unusual from the main road and didn't proceed to the actual shoreline. The emergence of both physical evidence and the previously dismissed 911 call transformed the atmosphere of the investigation. What had begun as concern was crystallizing into dread. Similar patterns had emerged in other notorious cases, like the Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959, where Soviet hikers fled their tent in terror, leaving behind their shoes and jackets despite sub-zero temperatures. Before their bodies were found, scattered across the snowy mountain, radio operators had picked up distress signals dismissed as atmospheric interference, early warnings written off as coincidence, until it was too late. By Friday, tension in Elm Ridge had mounted to a breaking point. The media presence grew from local news vans to regional affiliates. CNN sent a correspondent. Satellite trucks lined Elm Ridge's Main Street. Theories proliferated, from accidental drowning to alien abduction, from wilderness misadventure to deliberate disappearance. Mark's employer, Pacific Northwest Credit Union, offered a $25,000 reward for information. The First Presbyterian Church organized prayer vigils. The elementary school brought in counselors for Sam and Lily's classmates. Yet amid the growing attention, something shifted in Elm Ridge itself, a subtle withdrawal, a collective hesitation. When reporters asked neighbors about the Coldwells, Responses became increasingly standardized. They were private people. Kept to themselves, really. Nice family, but we didn't know them well. These descriptions contradicted everything previously known about a family deeply embedded in community life. A family that hosted backyard barbecues, volunteered at school events, and whose Christmas card list included over 100 local names. But now, as cameras rolled, Elmridge seemed to be rewriting its own memory of who the Coldwells had been. And amid the mounting fear and frustration came the silence. A silence that would prove more damning than any evidence. By the second week, national media had descended on Elmridge like a storm. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC broadcast live from Main Street. A photograph of the Coldwell children, smiling in their school pictures, became the image associated with every update. Vanished, family of 4 missing without a trace, crawled across bottom-of-screen chyrons nationwide. But as public interest peaked, local cooperation waned. The volunteer search parties dwindled from hundreds to dozens. Residents began declining interviews. Store owners posted no media signs in windows. At Elmridge Diner, a hub of local gossip for decades, conversations fell silent when outsiders entered. Lucy Tran, a 26-year-old reporter for the Elmridge Gazette, noticed the shift immediately. As the only local journalist with deep community connections, she expected neighbors to confide in her. Instead, doors closed. It was like watching a town develop collective amnesia, she later wrote. People who had been at the Coldwells' Labor Day barbecue just 6 weeks earlier suddenly couldn't recall basic details about them. The silence wasn't just strange, it felt orchestrated. Digging deeper, Tran discovered troubling inconsistencies in official statements. The search logs showed fewer volunteers than publicly claimed. GPS tracking data revealed that certain areas, particularly near Hollow Creek's land, were marked searched in reports but never actually visited by search teams. When she questioned Sheriff Lorne about these discrepancies, his response was tersely professional. Due to private property restrictions and dangerous terrain, some areas required specialized teams or drone surveillance rather than ground searches. But Tran's sources at the county assessor's office confirmed no drones had been deployed over Hollow Creek property. The area had simply been excluded from the search without explanation. Meanwhile, locals who initially expressed shock about the disappearance began avoiding the topic entirely. At the Harvest Festival committee meeting, which Elaine Coldwell had co-chaired the previous year, her name wasn't mentioned once. When Tran attempted to interview parents from Sam's Little League team, 5 families canceled consecutively, each citing sudden scheduling conflicts. This collective silence wasn't merely self-preservation, it resembled fear. Several residents later admitted to hearing strange sounds near the reservoir that weekend. Dorothy Keene, whose backyard bordered the Forest Service road, told Tran privately that she'd heard strange chanting and seen bonfires reflected against low clouds over the reservoir. But when asked to make an official statement, she backtracked completely. "I probably just heard coyotes," she amended, "and the lights were probably just campers." What Tran didn't know then, what wouldn't emerge until decades later, was that several Elmridge residents had received unmarked envelopes containing single white index cards the day after the Coldwells vanished. Each card bore the same typewritten message: "The forest protects those who protect it." No signature. No explanation needed. In small towns like Elmridge, silence isn't just about self-preservation, it's tradition. People learn early that belonging requires discretion. That community means protecting your own, even if that protection costs someone else their life. That some truths are better left unspoken if speaking them threatens the collective peace. This pattern of community silence had emerged in other high-profile disappearances, like Susan Powell in 2009, whose neighbors later admitted noticing troubling behavior from her husband but never reporting it. Or the case of Maura Murray, who vanished in 2004 after a car accident in rural New Hampshire, where locals initially claimed to have seen nothing, despite being mere feet from the scene. When truth threatens belonging, silence wins, and silence can kill just as effectively as any weapon. By the third week of the investigation, Sheriff Lorne announced a scaling back of search operations, citing exhaustion of all viable leads. The FBI, which had briefly consulted, withdrew its agents. The media presence thinned as newer tragedies demanded attention elsewhere. Elmridge began the subtle process of moving on, not through resolution, but through calculated forgetting. The Coldwells' home sat empty, the mortgage paid through an automatic withdrawal system that would continue for another 6 months before the bank finally foreclosed. Their mail accumulated until a church volunteer began collecting it. Their dog, found wandering near the elementary school days after their disappearance, was adopted by Elaine's dental hygienist. Life continued. The mystery calcified into local folklore, a story to warn teenagers away from the reservoir after dark. Don't go to Blackridge at night. Remember the Coldwells. But someone wasn't content to let silence win, and she knew this orchestrated forgetting was hiding something far more sinister than chance. Mara Jensen learned about her sister's family disappearing from a Facebook message, not a phone call. The estrangement between the sisters had been so complete that no one in Elmridge even thought to contact her directly. Saw the news about Elaine and her family, wrote a former college roommate. Aren't they your relatives? It's all over CNN. For Mara, 47 and teaching psychology at Seattle Pacific University, the news hit like physical pain. She and Elaine hadn't spoken since their mother's funeral 5 years earlier, a falling out over inheritance that had hardened into stubborn silence on both sides. Now that silence would be permanent. She drove the 4 hours to Elmridge in a daze, arriving just in time for the community candlelight vigil on the town square. Hundreds of people gathered, holding flickering lights as the Presbyterian minister offered prayers for the missing family. Mara stood at the back, unrecognized, watching faces illuminate in the gentle light. I knew none of them, she later told Lucy Tran. But they all claimed to know my sister. Something felt performative about their grief, too practiced, too uniform. Walking through the improvised memorial, photos, flowers, children's drawings, she noticed something subtle that others might have missed. The handwriting on multiple sympathy cards displayed similar characteristics. Different signatures, different colored pens, but the same precisely formed letters, the same spacing between words, as if written by the same hand disguising itself. After the vigil, she visited the sheriff's station. The desk officer was polite but dismissive. The case is under control, ma'am. Sheriff Lorne is handling it personally. I'm Elaine Coldwell's sister, Mara clarified. A flicker of something, recognition, alarm, crossed the officer's face before his expression resettled into professional neutrality. I'll make a note that you're in town. Someone will contact you if there are updates. The interaction left Mara with a creeping sense of wrongness. The officer's response seemed rehearsed, as if he'd been prepared for her arrival, as if someone had anticipated a relative might eventually come asking questions. She checked into the only motel in town, a weathered 2-story building on the highway. The clerk barely looked at her ID, but his eyes lingered on her face a beat too long. You look familiar, he said. I'm Elaine Coldwell's sister. His hand paused mid-keystroke. Oh, I'm sorry about your loss. They haven't been found, Mara corrected. It's not a loss yet. The clerk's expression shifted subtly. Right, of course. In her room, Mara spread out the newspaper clippings and printouts she'd collected, creating a timeline of the disappearance. The more she reviewed the public details, the more questions emerged. Why had the search been scaled back so quickly? Why were there no photos of the search operation released to the media? Why had nobody mentioned the weird jurisdictional issues around the reservoir? The next morning, she sought out Lucy Tran at the Gazette office, introducing herself as Elaine's sister. The young reporter's cautious expression immediately transformed. "I've been trying to make sense of this for weeks," Tran admitted, lowering her voice despite the empty office. "But nobody will talk to me anymore. It's like the whole town made a decision overnight to stop caring." The two women compared notes, Mara's outsider perspective complementing Tran's local knowledge. Together, they identified the strangest element of the case: the differential treatment of the search areas. The public campgrounds had been exhaustively examined, while the northern shore, owned by the Hollow Creek Collective, had barely been touched. "What exactly is this collective?" Mara asked. Tran pulled up county property records on her computer. On paper, they're an environmental conservation group that purchased about 500 acres on the north side of the reservoir in 1992. They maintain it as a nature sanctuary. No public access, minimal development. Their tax filings list them as a religious nonprofit focused on earth-centered spiritual practices. "A cult?" Mara asked. "Not officially. They have proper permits for their buildings, pay taxes on non-exempt activities, participate in county environmental initiatives. Their leader, everyone calls him Pastor Glenn, shows up at town council meetings whenever there's a conservation issue on the agenda. They keep to themselves otherwise. And they own the land where those lights were seen the night my sister vanished." Tran nodded slowly. "The same land that was never properly searched." Mara's investigation wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about breaking through a silence that had become deafening. But what she discovered next proved that silence wasn't ignorance. It was design. Armed with questions that grew more specific by the hour, Mara and Lucy began methodically examining the official investigation. Lucy filed public records requests for the search documentation, satellite imagery of the reservoir, and all 911 calls from the weekend of the disappearance. While waiting for those records, Mara visited the county library to review archived news coverage. Comparing the initial reports with later updates revealed subtle shifts in the official narrative. Sheriff Lorne's first press conference described an ongoing, exhaustive search of all surrounding areas. 3 days later, he referenced jurisdictional limitations affecting comprehensive coverage. By the 2-week mark, his statements mentioned all accessible areas have been thoroughly examined. The evolution suggested a narrowing of the search parameters that had never been explicitly acknowledged. When the records request was fulfilled, the discrepancies became impossible to ignore. The GPS tracking data from search teams' equipment showed large sections of the northern shore, Hollow Creek property, marked as completed in reports, but never actually visited according to the tracking points. More troublingly, the evidence logs listed one partial camcorder tripod and wetsuit fragment recovered on day 4, but no photographs of these items were included. The official inventory described them as non-evidentiary and noted they had been returned to storage. Lucy and Mara took their findings directly to Sheriff Lorne, requesting an interview at the station. After keeping them waiting for 40 minutes, he received them in his office, his manner professionally detached. "I understand your concerns," he said after they presented their questions, "but I can assure you everything was above board. The search was conducted according to standard protocols, with adjustments made for terrain and property boundaries." "Why wasn't a warrant secured to search the Hollow Creek property thoroughly?" Mara asked. The sheriff's expression tightened. "We did secure an emergency warrant for the shoreline where the tripod was found. For the remainder of their property, we didn't have probable cause to suggest the missing persons were there. We can't just search private property without legal justification." But you had reports of unusual lights and sounds from that exact area on the night they disappeared, Lucy pressed. Unsubstantiated reports, Lorne corrected. Insufficient for a warrant. When Mara requested to see the original evidence photos of the recovered tripod, Lorne's response was immediate. Those would be with the case file, which is still active and not available for public review. Lucy followed up with a formal records request specifically for the evidence photographs. 3 days later, the county clerk's office responded that the materials could not be located in current archives. The implication was clear. The photos had either been misplaced, misfiled, or deliberately removed. Just as their investigation seemed to hit a wall, an unexpected package arrived at the Gazette office addressed to Lucy. No return address, no note inside, just a plain envelope containing a single Polaroid photograph. The image showed the Coldwell's van from an angle different than any officially released photo. In this version, the vehicle was parked slightly differently than in the police photographs, the passenger door standing ajar, a dark stain visible on the ground beside it. The photo's edge captured a glimpse of what appeared to be a boot print larger than what would match Mark Coldwell's shoe size. Lucy immediately recognized the significance. This was taken before the official processing of the scene. Look at the position. It's different. Someone moved the van between this photo and the official documentation. The envelope bore a postal mark from Gresham, a town 30 miles away. After several calls, Lucy traced it to a retired deputy named Michael Crane, who had left the department 2 weeks after the Coldwell disappearance. When they drove to his home, the former officer was initially reluctant to speak. "I shouldn't have sent that," he said, glancing nervously at his front yard. "But I couldn't keep carrying it." Inside his modest home, Crane revealed he'd been one of the first responders to the scene, but had been reassigned the next day. The Polaroid was one he'd taken personally before the evidence team arrived. "Standard procedure was to document exactly as found," he explained. "But when I came back from setting up the perimeter, the van had been moved. Sheriff said it was to secure the vehicle properly. But you don't move evidence without documenting why." "Why did you leave the department?" Mara asked. Crane's voice lowered. "I raised concerns about the search parameters, asked why we weren't pushing harder for full access to Hollow Creek property. The next day, Lorne called me in, said I was being transferred to night dispatch for the remainder of the investigation. 2 weeks later, I found transfer papers on my desk, reassignment to the county jail. After 15 years of patrol, I took early retirement instead." "Do you think Sheriff Lorne was deliberately limiting the investigation?" Lucy asked. Crane chose his words carefully. "I think he was under pressure. From who or why, I don't know. But I've worked dozens of missing persons cases, and this one was handled differently from the start." His testimony crystallized what they had begun to suspect. Those tasked with finding the truth were instead containing it. The authority meant to investigate was working to limit what could be found. This pattern, what could be called the authority mirror, appears in numerous cases where power protects itself rather than those it serves. Law enforcement officers who suppress evidence that might implicate colleagues. Government officials who classify documents not for national security, but for institutional protection. Those wearing the badge of authority sometimes serve a narrative rather than justice. Crane offered one final piece of information before they left. There was a second 911 call that weekend. Came in Sunday morning, before the family was reported missing. Female caller sounded young, said something about people in robes by the water and they're not letting them leave. Dispatch coded it as a probable prank because the caller hung up when asked for her name. But after the Coldwells were reported missing, I tried to pull the recording, and it had been purged from the system. Crane's revelation suggested not just negligence, but active obstruction. If Sheriff Lorne was protecting someone or something rather than pursuing the investigation fully, the implications were chilling. With access to official channels clearly compromised, Mara and Lucy needed to look elsewhere for the truth, to the only witness that had been present from the beginning, recording everything with impartial patience: the forest itself. If you want to find what happened at Black Ridge, look at the water, not the shore, Michael Crane had told them before they left. Whatever went into that reservoir is still there. Taking his advice literally, Lucy connected with an unlikely alliance, a group of environmental science graduate students from Portland State University who had been mapping Black Ridge's underwater topography as part of a climate change study. Their research used advanced sonar and underwater drones to track sediment shifts and water level changes over time. Dr. James Park, their faculty supervisor, was initially reluctant to share data from an active research site. But when Lucy explained the connection to the Coldwell case, his hesitation transformed into interest. "We've been mapping the reservoir quarterly for 3 years," he explained, spreading high-resolution underwater contour maps across his office table. "Our focus is environmental, not forensic, but our equipment detects any solid object larger than 6 inches in diameter." The most recent scan, taken just 2 weeks earlier, showed something the previous scans hadn't: a collection of metallic shapes under the waterline, buried beneath sediment layers approximately 30 feet deep near the northern shore. "That wasn't in our April survey," Dr. Park confirmed. "Something's been exposed by the seasonal water level drop. Could be old logging equipment. This was timber country before the reservoir was created in the 1960s. Or evidence," Mara finished. With Dr. Park's reluctant permission, they brought the coordinates to Crane, who connected them with a private dive team specializing in evidence recovery. The team's leader, a retired police diver named Rebecca Wells, reviewed the sonar images with professional interest. "Definitely worth investigating," she concluded. "But we'd need permits for a recovery operation. That's Hollow Creek property." "What if we were just doing environmental research?" Lucy suggested. "Dr. Park's study has all the necessary permits for water sampling and sediment analysis." The plan took shape. The dive team would accompany the graduate students during their legitimate research dive, with an equipment test that would bring them to the coordinates of interest. 3 days later, under overcast skies that threatened rain, 2 boats drifted across Black Ridge Reservoir. On one, Dr. Park and his students collected water samples and operated sonar equipment. On the other, Rebecca Wells and her diving partner prepared their gear while Mara and Lucy watched nervously from shore, communicating via radio. The dive lasted 47 minutes. When Wells surfaced, her expression was unreadable behind her mask. Back at the boat ramp, she transferred a sealed evidence container to Crane without a word, then pulled him aside for a private conversation. When Crane returned to where Mara and Lucy waited, his face had lost all color. "It's not the Coldwell's van," he said first, answering their unspoken question. "It's an old Ford pickup, probably from the 90s, heavily corroded. Been down there at least a decade." "That's it?" Lucy asked, disappointment evident. "No." Crane hesitated. Inside the truck cab, under the passenger seat, they found something wrapped in oilcloth. Rebecca said it was deliberately preserved, not just abandoned. He opened the container. Inside lay a plastic bag containing what was unmistakably a camcorder cassette tape. She said the oilcloth was sealed with candle wax, Crane added. "Someone wanted this to survive underwater." The implications were staggering. The tape hadn't accidentally fallen into the reservoir. It had been deliberately preserved and hidden. But by whom? And why in a submerged truck unrelated to the Coldwells? Getting the waterlogged tape analyzed wouldn't be easy. The county crime lab would require official requisition forms, which meant involving Sheriff Lorne. Instead, Crane suggested a contact at Western Oregon University's Media Preservation Department, a specialist in recovering damaged audio and video. Professor Anika Desai's laboratory looked more like an electronics museum than an academic office, with vintage playback devices lining metal shelves alongside state-of-the-art digital equipment. She examined the sealed tape with professional curiosity. Interesting preservation method, she noted. The oilcloth and wax would have provided decent waterproofing, but water always finds a way eventually. I'll need to dry it completely before attempting playback, then use a chemical stabilizer on the magnetic coating. Even then, no guarantees. The process would take at least 3 days. While they waited, Mara and Lucy continued piecing together what they could about Hollow Creek Collective. County records showed the group had purchased the land in 1992 with funds from an anonymous donor. Their membership records were private, but annual reports mentioned approximately 50 resident members and 200 affiliated supporters. Their public presence was minimal: a simple website describing environmental initiatives, occasional participation in community cleanup events, and quarterly nature celebration gatherings that were members only. Their leader, Glenn Shepard, the Pastor Glenn locals referenced, had no social media presence and had given only one interview to the Gazette in 1997 about a wetland restoration project. "They're careful to appear legitimate," Lucy observed. "All the proper permits, tax filings, legal structures, the perfect cover for something else entirely." On the third day, Professor Desai called. Her voice held controlled excitement. "You need to come see this. I've recovered about 60% of the footage. It's not what I expected." In her lab, she had the tape loaded into a specialized player connected to a high-definition monitor. "I've stabilized what I could and enhanced the image quality where possible. Some sections are completely gone. Others just have audio. But there's enough." The footage began with shaky shots of a campsite. Not the Coldwell's site, but somewhere with a different view of the reservoir. Children played in the background, though their faces were too blurred to identify. A woman's voice, possibly Elaine Coldwell, could be heard giving instructions about staying close to camp. Then the camera panned across the water toward the northern shore. There, barely visible in the distance but unmistakable once seen, were figures moving among the trees. The zoom function activated, bringing them into sharper focus. People in long, hooded garments, forming a circle around what appeared to be a central fire. "I count 11 figures," Mara said quietly, all in matching robes. The footage jumped, damage to the tape creating a gap, and resumed with a nighttime scene. The camera, now positioned closer to the northern shore, recorded distant chanting and firelight. A whispered voice, presumably Mark Coldwell behind the camera, murmured, "We shouldn't be filming this." Elaine's voice responded, "People need to know what they're doing up here." Another jump, and the final recoverable segment showed a terrifying scene. The camera lying on its side, apparently dropped, capturing footsteps approaching through underbrush. A hand reached for the lens, not Mark or Elaine's, but someone wearing what looked like a black glove or severely discolored skin. The image cut to static. The final seconds contained only audio, a child's voice, possibly Sam Coldwell, saying simply, "They found us." Then nothing. The lab fell silent as the screen went dark. Professor Desai spoke first. The footage timestamps indicate this was recorded the Saturday night of their disappearance, between 9:48 p.m. and 11:32 p.m. The last audio segment is time-coded 11:53 p.m. They were documenting whatever Hollow Creek was doing, Lucy realized. They weren't random victims. They were witnesses. "But who put the tape in that truck?" Crane asked. "And when?" The question hung unanswered, but the implication was clear. Someone had wanted this evidence preserved, but hidden. Someone who couldn't come forward directly, but couldn't let the truth disappear completely. The recovered footage transformed their understanding of the case. The Coldwells hadn't simply vanished while camping. They had apparently stumbled upon some kind of ritual or gathering on Hollow Creek property and attempted to document it. The tape suggested they were discovered in the act, with consequences too disturbing to contemplate. Yet the most chilling aspect wasn't what the footage showed, but what it implied. For 25 years, the truth about what happened that night had been systematically suppressed, not just by whoever was directly responsible, but potentially by an entire network of protection extending to local authorities. The forest had finally yielded its first real clue. But this revelation wasn't the end of the mystery. It was merely the beginning of understanding how deep the conspiracy truly ran. Before they could determine their next steps, however, nature itself intervened with a revelation none of them anticipated. Spring 2024 brought record rainfall to northern Oregon, followed by an early heat wave that accelerated the mountain snowmelt. The combination sent unprecedented water volumes surging through the region's watershed. Black Ridge Reservoir, managed by the Army Corps of Engineers, reached critical levels by late April. In a controversial decision, authorities implemented emergency releases to prevent dam failure, dropping the reservoir's water level by nearly 20 feet in a week, the lowest it had been since construction in the 1960s. As the water receded, it exposed shorelines that had been submerged for decades. County environmental teams were dispatched to assess potential ecological impacts from the sudden exposure of long-submerged terrain. On May 7th, a drone operator with the environmental assessment team captured images that would rewrite the final chapter of the Coldwell mystery. The aerial footage, intended to document algae growth patterns, revealed something else entirely: the distinctive silhouette of a minivan, standing upright on what had once been a submerged slope, approximately 200 yards from the original search area. The vehicle's license plate, though corroded, remained legible enough for software enhancement to confirm what many had already suspected: ERC 349, the Coldwell family vehicle. Sheriff Henry Lorne, now in his 70s and 5 years into retirement, was informed about the discovery before the general public. His successor, Sheriff Maria Delgado, made the difficult call personally. "We found the Coldwell vehicle," she told him. "The reservoir drawdown exposed it." Lorne's response, according to Delgado, was telling. Not surprise, but resignation. "I always knew the water would give them back eventually," he said. The recovery operation drew national media attention. CNN returned to Elmridge for the first time in decades. The story of the family that vanished in 1999 found a new audience on social media platforms that hadn't existed when they disappeared. Coldwell mystery began trending on Twitter. Lucy Tran, now the Gazette's editor-in-chief, covered the story with the expertise of someone who had never stopped investigating it. Mara Jensen flew in from Seattle, where she had continued working as a psychology professor while maintaining a small website dedicated to her sister's case. The vehicle recovery proceeded with meticulous care. 25 years underwater had taken its toll, but modern forensic techniques could still extract significant evidence from the sealed environment of the van's interior. What they found defied initial expectations. The van was empty of human remains. The seating was configured as if for normal driving, not disturbed or indicative of a struggle. The keys remained in the ignition, turned to the off position. Luggage was still intact in the rear cargo area. Most significantly, in the glove compartment, sealed inside a plastic grocery bag secured with duct tape, was the missing camcorder, preserved in a manner similar to the tape they had found in the submerged truck. Someone wanted these to be found eventually, forensic technician Jessica Huang observed. The preservation methods were deliberate, designed to protect from water damage for extended periods. The camcorder's internal tape was carefully extracted and subjected to the same restoration process Professor Desai had used on the previous footage. What it revealed was devastating. The recording began innocuously, Lily collecting stones by the shore, Sam helping Mark set up the tent, Elaine calling them for sandwiches. Normal family moments from Saturday afternoon. Then a time jump to evening. The family around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows. In the background, barely audible at first, came sounds from across the water, rhythmic chanting, drumming. Mark could be heard saying, "What is that? Some kind of party?" Elaine's response, "That's Hollow Creek land. They don't allow visitors." The camera then captured Mark's decision to investigate, loading the family into the van to drive around to a better vantage point. The footage bounced as the van moved, then stabilized as they parked at a new location with a clearer view across the water. What the camera recorded next confirmed their worst fears. Figures in dark robes moving in a ceremonial circle around a massive bonfire. The zoom function revealed details not visible to normal eyesight. Elaborate symbols painted on the robes, participants wearing animal skull masks, a central figure raising what appeared to be a ceremonial staff. Mark's whispered voice, "This is crazy. We should report this to someone." Elaine, "No one would believe us without evidence. That's why we need to record it." The footage continued as Mark crept closer through the trees, apparently leaving Elaine and the children in the van. The camera captured several minutes of the ceremony, including what appeared to be participants drinking from a shared vessel and chanting in a language that linguistic experts would later struggle to identify. Then, disaster. A sudden commotion, shouting, the camera swinging wildly as Mark apparently ran back toward the van. His breathless voice, "They saw me. We need to go. Now." The final segment showed the family rushing back into the van, Mark starting the engine. Headlights swept across the trees as the van turned around, then froze on multiple robed figures blocking the narrow road ahead. The last audible words came from Elaine. "Oh God, they're here." Then the camera fell, capturing only the floor mat, as sounds of the van doors opening filled the audio. A child, likely Sam, cried out once. Then the recording ended. The recovered footage transformed the Coldwell case from mysterious disappearance to apparent abduction. But by whom? And why had the van been found in the reservoir when the family had clearly been intercepted on the road? These questions led investigators back to Hollow Creek Collective, the group whose ceremony the Coldwells had apparently witnessed and recorded. But in the 25 years since the disappearance, Hollow Creek had undergone significant changes. In 2010, the organization had officially dissolved, donating its land to the Nature Conservancy. Its founder, Glenn Shepard, had died in 2018 according to public records. Former members had scattered, many changing names or leaving the state entirely. Yet as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged. The paper trail of Hollow Creek's dissolution contained irregularities, signatures that didn't match earlier documents, financial discrepancies in the final tax filings, and a suspicious gap between the announced closure and the actual property transfer. Moreover, Glenn Shepard's death certificate had been filed in Arizona, but no coroner's report or medical records could be located to verify the cause of death. The witness signatures belonged to individuals whose identities could not be traced. Most disturbing was what Lucy discovered while reviewing satellite imagery of the northern shore. Despite the official transfer to the Nature Conservancy, regular gatherings had continued at the site until at least 2020. Aerial photos captured circular clearings, consistent with large bonfires, and what appeared to be temporary structures erected and dismantled multiple times per year. The collective hadn't truly disbanded. It had simply gone further underground. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the van yielded one final chilling piece of evidence. DNA samples recovered from the steering wheel included Mark Coldwell's as expected, but also those of an unknown male. The vehicle had been driven by someone else after the family's abduction, someone who had deliberately submerged it in the reservoir's deepest section. The evidence pointed to a carefully orchestrated cover-up. The family intercepted while documenting an unauthorized ritual, their vehicle driven into the reservoir to suggest an accident, and an entire community including law enforcement, pressured into silence. What the tape revealed next would not only reopen the investigation, it would destroy what little innocence the town had left. With the recovered footage now in official evidence, a joint task force was established between county authorities and the FBI's Special Investigations Unit. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed details invisible to casual viewing. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic anthropologist specializing in ritual practices, identified patterns in the Hollow Creek ceremony that matched known characteristics of several closed spiritual movements. The circular formation, the use of animal iconography, and the staff-bearing central figure are consistent with what we've documented in certain fringe groups that emerged in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1980s and early 1990s, she explained in her preliminary report. What's distinctive here is the apparent sophistication and scale of the ritual. This wasn't amateur practice. Most significantly, enhanced frames from the footage revealed reflections in water puddles that captured 3 additional robed figures positioned in the trees behind the Coldwell family, individuals who had been monitoring them before the confrontation on the road. This suggested not just opportunistic silencing of accidental witnesses, but active surveillance. Lucy Tran's investigation took a different angle, focusing on the insignia visible on the robes. The symbol, a stylized tree with roots forming what appeared to be a face, matched the logo used by Hollow Creek Collective on their letterhead and property markers, but it also appeared, subtly modified, on materials belonging to 2 other organizations, New Dawn Ecological Trust, a land management group operating in 3 counties, and Restoration Fellowship, a non-denominational spiritual center in Portland. They're shell organizations, Lucy concluded after tracking their incorporation papers. Different names, same founding members, overlapping boards of directors. Hollow Creek wasn't just one isolated group, it was part of a network. Financial records supported this theory. Between 1992 and 2018, the 3 organizations had transferred over $4 million between their accounts, purchased properties throughout Oregon and Washington, and received donations from dozens of anonymous limited liability companies. Most damning were the archived tax filings that revealed Sheriff Henry Lorne had not merely known the group, as he'd claimed during the original investigation. He had been a financial contributor, donating annually to New Dawn Ecological Trust from 1995 until his retirement in 2019. The connections deepened when records showed that Hollow Creek had purchased multiple parcels of woodland adjacent to Black Ridge Reservoir between 1992 and 1997, classified in county documents as private worship areas and ecological study sites. These properties created a nearly contiguous private holding of over 2,000 acres surrounding the northern half of the reservoir, land that had been explicitly excluded from the original search for the Coldwell family. Dr. Vasquez's team made another significant discovery while reviewing the ceremonial patterns. The ritual captured on the Coldwell's recording matched descriptions from indigenous oral histories of territory cleansing ceremonies, practiced by certain splinter groups that had appropriated and distorted traditional practices. These weren't authentic indigenous rituals, she clarified. They were manufactured practices created by the group's leadership to justify territorial control. The core doctrine appears to center around returning the earth to its rightful balance, a philosophy that framed human disappearances as acts of release or natural reclamation. This ideology provided both motivation and justification for removing those who threatened the group's control of what they considered sacred land, people like the Coldwell family, who had accidentally documented their secret practices. The pattern that emerged wasn't just about a family in the wrong place at the wrong time. It revealed a sophisticated organization with tentacles reaching into local governance, law enforcement, and business, a group capable of orchestrating not just a disappearance, but the systematic suppression of any meaningful investigation. Comparable patterns had emerged in other cult investigations. Heaven's Gate in 1997, with its carefully managed public image, or the NXIVM organization's complex hierarchy of shell companies and influence networks. The difference was that Hollow Creek had apparently succeeded in maintaining its secrets for 25 years, operating behind a veil of environmental stewardship and spiritual language that deflected serious scrutiny. For Mara Jensen, these revelations transformed her understanding of what happened to her sister's family. It wasn't random tragedy or wilderness misadventure. It was calculated elimination of witnesses who could expose the group's activities. Now I understood, she later wrote, the danger wasn't that my family was missing. The danger was that their disappearance had been engineered to stay missing. But the most difficult confrontation still lay ahead, with the man who had led the original investigation while concealing his own connections to those responsible. Henry Lorne had aged considerably since his retirement 5 years earlier. At 74, his once commanding presence had diminished into the frail frame of an old man living alone in a small house on the outskirts of Elmridge. When Mara and Lucy arrived unannounced on his doorstep, accompanied by FBI Special Agent Carlos Dominguez, his expression registered resignation rather than surprise. "I've been expecting you," he said simply, opening the door wider, "ever since they found the van." In his modest living room, surrounded by fishing trophies and faded photographs from his law enforcement career, Lorne faced the consequences of decisions made decades earlier. Agent Dominguez Dantes began by stating that the investigation had uncovered Lorne's financial ties to organizations connected to Hollow Creek Collective. "I want to be clear," Dominguez said, "that we're building a case around the Coldwell disappearance that now includes obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and potential conspiracy charges. Your cooperation now could influence how that proceeds." Lorne's gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond them. "You think I don't know what I did? What I failed to do? I've lived with it every day for 25 years. "Then tell us," Mara said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Tell me what happened to my sister and her family." The former sheriff's confession emerged slowly at first, then in a torrent of suppressed guilt and rationalization. "I wasn't part of it. Not like you think," he began. "I made donations to New Dawn because they sponsored youth wilderness programs. My grandson participated. I knew they were connected to Hollow Creek, but I thought it was just environmental work, spiritual retreats, nothing sinister." He described how 3 days after the Coldwells were reported missing, he received an unmarked envelope containing a thumb drive. On it was a brief video clip showing Mark Coldwell filming the Hollow Creek ceremony, followed by a message: "Protect the sacred. Protect your family." "There was a photo of my grandson included," Lorne continued, his voice hollow, "at his school. Taken that same day." The message was clear. According to Lorne, he was then contacted by phone by a man identifying himself only as a custodian of Hollow Creek. The man explained that the Coldwells had violated sacred space by recording private ceremonies, and that they had been guided to a different path. He instructed Lorne to ensure the investigation focused on the possibility of accidental drowning or voluntary disappearance. He said if I cooperated, no one else would need to be guided away, including my family, Lorne recalled. If I didn't, he said more evidence of my devotion would surface. "Your donations to the group?" Lucy clarified. Lorne nodded. "And photos of me at a New Dawn retreat 2 years earlier." "Nothing illegal happened there, but context could make it look like I was a member, not just a community supporter. My career, my marriage, everything would be destroyed. And my family?" His voice trailed off. "So you buried the investigation?" Mara said, her tone hardening. "You protected murderers instead of finding my sister." I limited the search parameters, Lorne admitted, directed resources away from Hollow Creek property, classified evidence as non-relevant. I told myself I was protecting my family, that the Coldwells were already gone, and nothing could bring them back. But you kept the original tape, Agent Dominguez noted. The one recovered from the truck. You preserved it rather than destroying it. Lorne's eyes, watery with age and emotion, finally met theirs directly. That wasn't me. I don't know who put that tape in that truck or when. I suspect it was someone from inside Hollow Creek. Someone with doubts, with a conscience. There were schisms in the group over the years, power struggles after Shepard consolidated control. He paused, gathering his thoughts. What you need to understand is that Hollow Creek isn't just some fringe cult in the woods. At its peak, it had members in the county assessor's office, the school board, local businesses, people with influence, with resources. They could make things happen, or not happen. The pressure wasn't just on me. It was on everyone connected to the case. And the van? Lucy asked. How did it end up in the reservoir? I don't know the operational details, Lorne said. I was never told. My role was containment, not execution. The unintended double meaning of his last word hung in the air. Agent Dominguez pressed for specifics about Hollow Creek's current status, leadership structure, and potential hideaways. Lorne provided what information he could. Names of former mid-level members, properties that might still be used, financial connections that could be traced. Glenn Shepard is still alive, he added as they prepared to leave. The death certificate is fake. He relocated to a compound in eastern Oregon sometime around 2015. They call it the Sanctuary now, not Hollow Creek. Same group, new name. As Mara stood to leave, Lorne made one final admission. I kept files, he said, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. Things I couldn't bring myself to destroy. Evidence I hid instead of logging properly. He removed a thick manila envelope, handing it to Agent Dominguez. This won't bring them back, but maybe it helps find the ones responsible. The envelope contained original photographs from the search scene, including images of the tripod and wetsuit fragment, partial transcripts of 911 calls that had been edited from official records, and most significantly, a handwritten list of Hollow Creek members in positions of authority throughout the county as of 2001. Mara looked at the man who had failed her sister, a man diminished by his own choices, haunted by a cowardice he had disguised as protection. I've thought about that family every day since they disappeared, Lorne said, his voice barely audible. I tell myself I had no choice. But that's a lie we all tell when we're afraid. I had choices. I made the wrong ones. As they left, Mara turned back one last time. Did they suffer? She asked, needing to know yet dreading the answer. Lorne's expression crumpled. I never asked. I didn't want to know. I'm sorry. The former sheriff's confession provided crucial information for the expanding investigation, but left the most important question unanswered. What had actually happened to the Coldwell family after their abduction? Where were their remains? The answer, when it finally came, would emerge not from testimony or technology, but from the Earth itself. Based on Lorne's information and satellite analysis of historical imagery, investigators identified a remote section of former Hollow Creek property that showed signs of regular disturbance between 1998 and 2002, a clearing approximately 2 acres in size that had been repeatedly excavated and refilled. The site, now owned by the Nature Conservancy but rarely accessed due to its difficult terrain, was located almost 5 miles from the reservoir, accessible only by a narrow fire road that had been deliberately unmaintained for decades. In June 2024, a joint FBI county team established an evidence recovery operation at the location. Ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple anomalies beneath the surface, irregular depressions consistent with excavation and refilling. As the careful archaeological process began, investigators made a disturbing discovery. Rather than intact human remains, they found a layered deposit of personal effects mixed with ash and partially melted artifacts. Jewelry, children's shoes, melted wristwatch fragments, a burned leather wallet, eyeglass frames, and various unidentifiable objects fused together by intense heat. The temperature required to create this level of material degradation would exceed 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Vasquez noted, "This wasn't a typical campfire or even a standard cremation. This was a sustained, controlled, high-temperature burn designed to eliminate biological material completely." DNA analysis of trace biological material found within soil samples confirmed the presence of genetic markers consistent with the Coldwell family, but in quantities too degraded for complete profiles. The evidence suggested a methodical effort to eliminate all identifiable human remains while preserving certain personal items, a ritualistic approach to disposal rather than simple concealment. Among the recovered items, one stood out for its partial preservation, a journal fragment consisting of several pages fused together by heat, with portions of the outermost page still legible. The handwriting matched samples of Elaine Coldwell's from family letters Mara had provided. The first legible line sent chills through the investigation team. They said we had to become like them to survive. Further fragments included references to joining the cycle, returning to the earth, and the forest claims what belongs to it. Phrases consistent with Hollow Creek's known philosophical framework as described by former members who had since left the group. The journal fragment suggested that the Coldwells had been held for some period before their ultimate fate, possibly as part of an indoctrination attempt that failed. The writings hinted at resistance. Mark still refuses to participate, and concern for the children, trying to make it a game for S and L to keep them calm. For Mara Jensen, these fragments provided both comfort and deeper anguish, evidence that her sister had remained strong-minded even in captivity, but also confirmation that the family had endured a prolonged ordeal rather than a quick end. The excavation continued for 3 weeks, eventually revealing a large circular depression approximately 15 feet in diameter, likely the location of a ceremonial pyre used in whatever ritual had consumed the Coldwell family. Carbon dating of ash layers suggested multiple burning events over several years, raising the horrifying possibility that the site had been used for other victims beyond the Coldwells. This possibility prompted investigators to review all unsolved disappearances within a 100-mile radius between 1990 and 2020. The pattern that emerged was subtle but undeniable. 17 individuals or small groups had vanished within the general area during that period, all classified as either lost in wilderness or presumed voluntary disappearance when searches yielded no results. In each case, Sheriff Lawrence Department had been involved in the investigation. In each case, the search parameters had excluded Hollow Creek properties, and in each case, the missing persons had last been seen near areas owned or frequented by collective members. What had initially appeared to be an isolated tragedy was revealing itself as potentially decades of methodical elimination of those who threatened the group's secrecy or control. The Coldwells weren't unique. They were simply the ones whose evidence had finally surfaced. This pattern matched what Dr. Vasquez had warned might be found, a cult ideology that framed disappearances as natural reclamation or returning to balance, providing spiritual justification for what was, in reality, ritual murder. As the excavation reached its final stages, one additional artifact emerged from the deepest layer of the burn site, a small, partially melted recorder similar to the devices used in the Hollow Creek ceremonies. When forensic technicians carefully extracted its damaged memory card, they recovered a 3-minute audio clip of what appeared to be Glenn Shepard addressing followers. The recording, dated October 18, 1999, the day after the Coldwells disappeared, contained a chilling monologue. The forest has reclaimed what was threatened. 4 souls have returned to the cycle, their energy feeding our sacred ground. Let their witnessing become their transformation. Let their seeing become their release. This final piece of evidence provided what prosecutors needed: direct connection between the group's leadership and the Coldwell disappearance, framed explicitly as a response to their witnessing of restricted activities. For the investigators, the physical evidence had come full circle, from mysterious disappearance to confirmed ritual killing with potential serial implications. For Mara Jensen, it brought a measure of clarity, if not peace. The truth about her sister's family was finally emerging, not from witness testimony or confession, but from the earth itself, which had held their secrets for a quarter-century. But for the community of Elmridge, the unfolding investigation brought a different kind of reckoning: the collective guilt of silence, of looking away, of allowing fear to suppress truth until the forest itself exposed what humans had tried to bury. On a cool September morning in 2024, Mara Jensen stood alone at the edge of Black Ridge Reservoir, watching fog curl across the still water. The surrounding forest, dressed in early autumn colors, seemed peaceful, almost absurdly so, given what she now knew had happened here. 25 years had passed since her sister's family had vanished. In that time, Mara had completed her PhD, published 3 books on trauma psychology, married and divorced, and built a life that had always felt incomplete. Now, as difficult as the truth had been, it had filled the void of uncertainty that had haunted her for decades. The investigation continued to expand. 8 members of the reorganized Hollow Creek group, now calling themselves the Sanctuary, had been arrested, including 3 former county officials. Glenn Shepard remained at large, believed to have fled to an undisclosed international location, but Interpol had issued a red notice for his arrest. More significantly, forensic teams had identified 5 additional probable disposal sites on former collective property, suggesting a pattern of ritualistic killings spanning decades. DNA analysis was ongoing, potentially connecting these sites to other long unsolved disappearances. For Elmridge, the reckoning was painful and divisive. Some residents, particularly younger ones, with no direct connection to the events of 1999, demanded complete transparency and accountability. Others, especially those who had been adults when the Coldwells disappeared, maintained defensive silence or claimed ignorance despite mounting evidence of community-wide complicity. The Elmridge Gazette, under Lucy Tran's leadership, published a comprehensive 16-page special edition documenting the investigation's findings. The final editorial, written by Tran herself, pulled no punches. The Coldwell case wasn't unsolved, it was unresolved. It shows how isolation protects danger, how silence perfects deception, how fear of exclusion leads to complicity and evil. Every resident who suspected something wrong but said nothing, every official who looked the other way, every community leader who prioritized peace over truth, all share responsibility for allowing darkness to flourish in our midst. The peace divided the town but sparked necessary conversations about collective responsibility and the dangers of unquestioning trust in authority. Churches held discussion forums. The high school developed a curriculum unit on ethical decision-making and the duty to report suspected wrongdoing. Nationally, the case reignited interest in rural cult activities and their methods of maintaining secrecy and control. Documentarians, true crime podcasters, and investigative journalists descended on Elmridge, each extracting different lessons from the tragedy. For Mara, none of this broader impact could bring back her sister's family. But standing by the water, she found a measure of peace in knowing that the truth had finally emerged, not through human courage, but through the patient persistence of the natural world itself. The water had preserved what humans had tried to destroy. The earth had held evidence until it could be properly examined. The forest, which had seemed to consume the Coldwells without a trace, had ultimately revealed their fate when human systems failed. As part of her personal closure, Mara had brought something to leave at the site: Lily's small toy dinosaur, recovered from the initial search area and kept in evidence for 25 years. Now cleaned and preserved, it represented the innocence lost that October day. She placed it carefully at the tree line, a small monument to what had been taken. The FBI investigation continued to uncover darker dimensions of the case. Agent Dominguez had informed her that authorities were reopening investigations into 17 other disappearances within a 50-mile radius, dating back to the early 1990s. Early indications suggested similar patterns: people who had ventured onto or near Hollow Creek territory, never to return. "We believe your sister's family wasn't the first," he had told her gently, "but because of the evidence they left behind, they might be the last." As Mara prepared to leave, a splash in the water caught her attention. A fish leaping and returning to the depths, momentarily breaking the mirror-like surface. She thought about how truth behaved the same way, surfacing briefly before submerging again, yet always present beneath the seemingly calm surface. The Coldwells were gone, but the truth about what happened to them had finally emerged. And somewhere in these woods, despite efforts to erase all traces, something still remembered. In her final interview for the Gazette's special edition, Mara had offered a reflection that resonated beyond the specific tragedy of her sister's family. What happened at Black Ridge reveals 5 warning signs we should never ignore. When routine becomes the perfect camouflage for danger, when silence becomes a community's reflex rather than resistance, when those in authority protect narratives instead of people, when evidence appears where it shouldn't logically exist, and when the past refuses to stay buried despite efforts to suppress it. The forest remembers what humans choose to forget, and eventually, no matter how deeply buried, the truth finds its way back to the surface. As she walked away from the reservoir for the final time, Mara carried with her not just the grief of knowing, but the responsibility of ensuring that the patterns that had allowed her sister's family to vanish would be recognized elsewhere before more lives were lost. The Coldwell case had ended, but its lessons about trust, silence, authority, evidence, and memory would continue to resonate far beyond the shores of Black Ridge Reservoir, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't strangers hiding in the wilderness. They're the familiar faces standing beside us, smiling, while they help rewrite the history of what happened in the woods. The most terrifying part of any disappearance isn't just the absence itself, it's how quickly the world adjusts to that absence, filling the void with comfortable explanations and reassuring lies. The Coldwell case teaches us that we must question the silence, challenge the narrative, and remember that the greatest human capacity isn't for evil, but for looking away while evil does its work.